I want to thank Penza State University, Professor Okshina, and Rector Dmitrievich for the kind invitation to come and address this topic today on the political and economic crisis in the United States, which in effect is also a crisis of society. So it is the very middle class that was expanded and in fact even created in the past century, which is now under threat. The crisis has been underway for some 3 decades, but it's primarily the past 5 years that I want to discuss. Now, as you all know, in 2008, there was a global financial crisis which was centered on Wall Street. And in effect, this represented, again, a crisis which had been building for some 3 decades. A crisis which was, in effect, a response to a previous crisis of competitiveness in the world system, with the United States beginning to fall behind. The response to that crisis by the United States was to shift toward its comparative advantage in finance. Now, after some 3 decades of this continued focus on finance, the system finally succumbed to its contradictions. In the 1970s, finance took some 15% of corporate profits in the United States. Now, this represented the real need in the economy for some financial intermediation. By the time the Wall Street crisis hit in 2008, that number was no longer 15%, it was 40%. Now, it doesn't take a specialist in economics to understand finance cannot add some 40% of the total value of the economy. In short, it was no longer enabling entrepreneurial activity. It was taking wealth out of the real economy. Now, as the power of finance grew, the fortunes of the middle class declined. And we have to think about just what the middle class is. The middle class represents the engineers, the researchers, the teachers, the doctors. In short, the people that make society function. There is no society without them. But in effect, the growth of finance was coming at the expense of the middle class, directly transferred from the middle class to finance. Well, as I said, this all came to a crash in the fall of 2008. And it was at this point that people such as myself thought that we would finally begin to reassess the value of this model and to take a different course. As the iconic British Prime Minister Winston Churchill once said of the United States always does the right thing. And then he would have a long pause, and he would say, after exhausting all other options. Now, the problem this time seems to be that the United States appears to have exhausted all of the bad options, but instead of now doing the right thing, has launched itself on an exhaustive search for more bad options. They are becoming increasingly rare and hard to find, but the United States is finding them nonetheless. Now, after the great financial crash and crisis of 1929, the Great Depression, the United States reacted to that crisis, which is very similar to our current crisis, in a very different way. It was thought that, and this, of course, was a much deeper crisis than the one we have today. So standard economic theory at the time said that if your government is in crisis, if your budgets are running out of, find themselves short of cash, of tax receipts, then what you must do is cut spending. And if people are unemployed, then one must merely cut wages until they are cheap enough to employ again. This reflected the economic thinking of the 19th century French economist that was known then and now as Say's law. Now, as we know, there's a different standard in science for a law than in economics. In economics, a law is something that you believe in. Economics, in short, is more faith-based than science-based, while claiming to be science-based. In science, the standard for a law is that it must be empirically proven and be correct under all circumstances and all times. What happened during the Great Depression is that wages continued to go down until people were willing to work for only food, not even wages. But they still could not find work. So in effect, there was no Say's law. So there was a new economic thinking which arose, and it essentially said that one must not think of the national economy like you would think of your household economy. That what makes sense to do on an individual level can be ruinous at the total or national level of the economy. What the government did was, instead of cutting its spending, it massively expanded its spending. It began developing massive infrastructure projects across the country. Roads, bridges, train stations, airports, schools, any number of public enterprise. But it recognized that an economy and a society was not merely comprised of material forces, but of human and cultural inputs as well, and it dedicated massive funding to the humanities, the arts. And so it spent heavily on the arts and humanities. The other thing that it did was it legislated minimum wage laws to drive wages up, not down. And it recognized that the economy was not functioning at its productive capacity, and that, in fact, people were now working at such an efficient level that we needed to reduce everyone's work hours, not increase them. Now, the purpose of my remarks regarding this history is not just to trap you all in this room while I give you a history lecture, but to give you a point of contrast with the present. Governments around the world, including in the United States, have responded in exactly the opposite fashion than we did in the 1930s. I should also add, with regards to the 1930s, that another essential element to the reforms was to regulate finance. It was recognized that if finance was left unchecked, without any restraint, it would be a very destructive force in society, which seems to have been confirmed in the 2008 crisis. Those reforms in the 1930s launched a period of 4 to 5 decades of unprecedented economic growth, prosperity, and expansion of the middle class. All of this is being undone today. Austerity policies are seeing cuts to our universities, our public sector generally, and again, we are operating under the assumption that the crisis must be solved by driving wages down and making people work longer hours, even as productivity has increased, and in fact, people should have more leisure, not less. Well, so that brings us up again to the 2008 crisis. Now, what has happened in the United States since then? Originally, it appeared as though the United States was going to follow some of the same policies that we saw in the 1930s. In the winter of 2009, a stimulus package for the economy, in other words, more government spending, with the idea that we would reinvest in the country's infrastructure. This very much concerned the Republican Party in the United States, which had begun to move increasingly in a rightward direction. So they saw this, in other words, as an ideological threat. And they began to undermine this stimulus package. Instead of it going towards things such as building new roads, high-speed rail, other infrastructure, it went to things such as tax cuts. So we did not have the investment in infrastructure and education that we thought we would have. But the public was told the opposite. We have some very conservative media outlets that kept pressing the message that we had a large stimulus bill which should have fixed the economy. And therefore, what was needed was a dramatic cut in budgets, not an increase in them. And that's what we got. Now, this ideological threat which I referenced resulted in a new, what we call in English, astroturf movement, which essentially means a false grassroots movement. astroturf being like plastic grass.
И
Это
они это
как
сравнивают с искусственным газоном.
искусственным газоном.
Да, это такое движение искусственного газона. Да?
So some of the most powerful oligarchs in the United States who were interested in further tax cuts, less regulation on finance, funded these astroturf movements and to generate a popular support for reducing the size of governments and the public sector. In 2010, they succeeded in taking over the U.S. Congress, our chief legislative making body. And they pushed forward this agenda of actually trying to generate further crises, budgetary crises, because they believed that if you could generate a crisis, this presented another opportunity to cut government spending even further. So we've had this perpetual environment since 2010 of budgetary crisis, organized, orchestrated for the purpose of further budget cuts. Meanwhile, now this group is called the Tea Party. To make a brief historical reference, in 1775, during the American Revolution, one of the first acts of the revolution was by these protesters against the British and their policies, which was to dump all of this tea into the harbor in Boston. In fact, this represented a massive destruction of private property. Ironically, the Tea Party today holds private property as entirely sacred. So, since 2010, in effect, we've had a very radical, extremist political movement come to power in the United States, whose purpose is to again create perpetual economic crisis. And it's not just at the federal level that they operate, but at the state level. So they've taken over the majority of state governments. We have all of these budget crises now occurring simultaneously at the state level as well. Now, you may have seen in the news this past week that the United States has had another one of these big budget crises, resulting in the threat to shut down the federal government. This has resulted in the laying off of some 800,000 public employees. Mm-hmm. And this follows a crisis in the month of March in which we cut spending even further, resulting in the loss of 1.6 million jobs across the entire economy, private and public sector. Now, the result has been that the economy has stagnated instead of expanded. Contra the economic theory of the Tea Party, which states that any starving of the public sector results in an expansion of the private sector and economic growth. And so this is again where we find ourselves at the moment. One economic crisis after the other, with threats of further crises as the Tea Party demands ever greater cuts. The consequence of this, ironically, has to create even more problems for the government. Because we have more unemployed, we have more people on welfare. So public assistance spending has actually increased rather than decreased. So the response of the Tea Party has been to say that we need to be more like Greece and to just start cutting spending to the public public assistance programs as well. So this is the problem that we see with austerity generally. Now, on one level, the United States and countries like Russia, which issue their own currency, their own money, have the power to spend within the limits of their economy's productive capacity. And neither the United States nor Russia is doing so. The consequence is that we're impoverishing our middle class, and we're losing tremendous value from tens of millions, literally, of people in both countries that could be adding goods and services to the economy. So the issue now is whether or not we will see a change from this policy or whether we will see its continuation. At core, there is a structural economic crisis which, in the big countries, represents it represents a pyramid structure for all of the big economies. The United States has a finance pyramid economy,
Финансовая пирамида.
which, as we know, is unsustainable. Russia has an energy pyramid economy, which depends on increasing prices for energy. This cannot be sustained, largely because of some fool's luck by the United States. In the last 3 years, the United States has developed new technologies for extracting natural gas and oil to keep global energy prices from rising. They're not going to go down, but they're not going to go up either. In the short term, this is deadly for Russia. In the medium to long term, if Russia responds properly, it could be the very best thing for Russia. If Russia decides to develop its manufacturing again and move off of this energy pyramid economy. China has an export pyramid economy, so it's dependent upon exports ever growing, and this cannot continue either. So all of these pyramid economies need to change. Now, the United States sees some return of manufacturing because this energy is actually making our electricity prices very low. Factories that previously had gone to Mexico, into China, are now coming back. Factories in places like Germany are considering coming to the United States because electricity prices are now 300% higher in Germany than they are in the United States because of this energy windfall. So if the United States can manage to rid itself of these austerity governments and this Tea Party, things might go very well. But it would have to also check or control its banking sector, its financial center, which it has thus far done almost nothing to do. Now, for Russia, the problem that we see, I'm being told to slow down on this side and to speed up on this side. For Russia, the problem is this. As I've said, and this goes back all the way to the 1960s, you've become dependent on your energy export sector. So this has to change. But it's not just that. It's also the financial sector. The chief issue is that much of the money that you could be using to rebuild your infrastructure is being sent to offshore banks in places like Latvia and Cyprus. So you're losing both tax revenue and investment capital. And as long as the money is leaving your country, you'll never fix your problems here. Now, ultimately, this money ends up going oftentimes to the major banks in West Europe and the United States. So they have an interest in seeing this system continue. So they will not stop it. You will have to. Meanwhile, referencing China, China has to figure out a way of consuming more of what it produces and dealing with its environmental crisis. Thus far, it's put much of its excess capital into real estate, and it's created a real estate bubble, just as we recently had in the West 5 years ago. So to sum up, the chief threats are austerity budgets, pyramid economy.
Это, собственно говоря, политика вот такой жесткой экономики.
Okay, so austerity budgets,
Политика жесткой
pyramid
экономики.
economies,
Это вот пирамидальная такой, это пирамида своего рода, существующая в странах.
and financial, we could call it terrorism. So we have to address all three of these things and also be mindful of ecological dimensions of our crisis as well. All big challenges, but unless we address them, we will only continue seeing the middle class shrink and the stagnation continue. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you. Sorry about rushing you.
Уважаемые коллеги, пожалуйста, вопросы.